One of the odd aspects of studying and thinking about knowledge, as I'm doing in some of these videos, is that I find myself, it has this odd self-reflexive quality, because of course the object of study, knowledge, is both the object of study and, if you like, the field or the area or the domain in which that object appears. So all the time that I'm talking about knowledge and thinking about it, I am using metaphors and organizational conceptual systems to frame that knowledge. So it's kind of meta-praxis, I suppose, something like that that's going on. Which does lead me into complications. I do find myself a little bit lost in those layers of thought sometimes. The particular aspect of that odd dual relationship that I'm thinking of right now is to do with how we conceive knowledge. When we think about knowledge, as when we think about anything else, we have to kind of identify it primarily as an entity or a phenomenon that can be thought about or studied or considered or used in some way. In much the same way as I could think about, in order to talk about or think about trees or birds, I have to identify them in some way prior to my analysis, prior to any formal analysis at least. So what's happening when I'm identifying knowledge? Well, here I want to make a little bit of a leap across to some of the work that Eleanor Roche did on conceptual categories, because part of the logic of identification, identifying a tree as a tree or identifying a bird as a bird, is dependent upon an ability to first locate that entity, that tree, that bird, within a category of trees and birds. That seems to be a fundamental part of the identification process from which subsequent analysis can proceed. And similarly with knowledge, which is where I'm going with this. But in terms of trees and birds, let's say, what Eleanor Roche demonstrated is that our ability to identify specific phenomenon, a specific event or a specific entity as a member of a category isn't how we might expect it to be. The usual method that one assumes is in operation when you assign something to a category is the identification of necessary and sufficient conditions. So to identify a tree as a tree in classical categorical terms, one would specify what the necessary and sufficient conditions were that had to be met in order for an entity to be recognizable as a tree. It's I don't know, a large wooden object with branches or something, and then you would look at the phenomenon, this object in here that I'm looking at right now, very beautiful line of trees actually, and then I would say, does that meet the necessary and sufficient conditions established within the criteria? And if it does, it's in the category, and if it doesn't, it's not. Now that's classical categorical systems, which Eleanor Roche demonstrated as not being the only way that we categorize, and probably not the most common way that we actually do categorize in practice. That might be how we form taxonomies within certain empirical structures, but intuitively and in our day-to-day thinking, it seems to be not how we do it. How we do it, according to Eleanor Roche, and this work has been developed by George Lakoff and others, is that we identify prototypical members of a particular category, and that is probably as prototypical a tree as you will ever find, and then we assign other entities as members of that category according to certain resemblances they may have to that, kind of Wittgensteinian family resemblances in a way. So where's this going in terms of knowledge? Right, okay, well just one last point on Eleanor Roche first before I move into that. What Eleanor Roche's work did, and she used birds as an example of a category that you can consider. What she discovered is that this idea that necessary and sufficient conditions, not only is this idea that necessary and sufficient conditions are the determinants for membership of a particular category, but membership of a category is not a simple binary possibility. In Roche's work, and as I say, she used birds as the example, whilst in a scientific or empirical taxonomic analytic strategy, it's very clear to say whether a bird is a bird or not, or an entity is a bird or not. There are necessary and sufficient conditions in those concepts. In lived experience, that's not apparently how we think. And in the experiment she did, it was very clear that the subjects who were interviewed and surveyed for this experiment felt that some birds were clearly birds,